Good to see everyone. I'm very happy to be here to give a talk on the first half of my second book in the Meade and Lee series that looks at the war in Virginia from the moment that Lee crosses the Potomac after Gettysburg until the end of 1863. This is a period that is often overlooked or lightly regarded by historians because it doesn't produce a great big battle. But in fact, it's an exceptionally busy period. The two great armies in Virginia did not go into hibernation for 6 months between the end of the Gettysburg campaign and the start of the Overland campaign. They were very, very busy. There was a great deal of maneuvering. There was a great deal of fighting. And as we will discover tonight, there was an enormous amount of important strategic decision-making. In fact, what happens in August and September and October of 1863 in Virginia really sets the stage for everything that's going to happen in 1864. This is the critical connective tissue, if you will, between Gettysburg and the Overland campaign, and indeed the Atlanta campaign as well. So my second book in the series, Meade and Lee at Bristoe Station, covers August, September, and October of 1863. But because the Bristoe campaign itself is very complex and quite fascinating, we're going to set the actual campaign off to the side for a future presentation. And tonight we're going to focus on what's going on in August and September of 1863 in Virginia and how that's going to impact the war going forward. So this is the road to Bristoe Station. It's going to take us right up to the opening of that campaign, which will be the last great offensive campaign of the Army of Northern Virginia, although of course nobody would have known that in the fall of 1863, nor would anyone have suspected that in the fall of 1863. So let's remember how we get to our starting point. So Lee had retreated over the Potomac on the night of July 13-14. He withdrew into the lower Shenandoah Valley, that is the northern reaches of the Shenandoah Valley. Meade had a few days later crossed into the Loudoun Valley, putting himself on Lee's strategic flank with the Blue Ridge Mountains and a flooded Shenandoah River separating the two armies. We gave both commanders fits in terms of gathering intelligence, but in a big picture, basically Meade is trying to plug the gaps in the mountains to prevent Lee from escaping back into central Virginia and resuming a blocking position between Washington and Richmond. Lee is trying to keep Meade from accomplishing his goal. Wants to get his army through those mountain passes. And after a 10-day chess match along the eastern and western slopes of the Blue Ridge, Lee manages to get through the mountains and foil the Federal attempt to trap his army in the lower valley and perhaps crush it against the south bank of the Potomac in a way that it had not been able to crush it on the north bank of the Potomac at Williamsport. So the Confederates have gotten through the mountains and they withdraw to Culpeper County in Virginia. That means that they're behind the upper Rappahannock River, which is what you see right here. This is where the Confederate forces are. They're mostly grouped around Culpeper Courthouse with the cavalry guarding the flanks and deployed forward to watch for the Federals. The Army of the Potomac, on the other hand, after its disappointment at Manassas Gap, on July 23-24 of 1863, had found itself basically all but out of provisions, and it had to pivot very quickly eastward and march on Warrenton, Virginia, where it could reconnect with the Orange and Alexandria Railroad via the Warrenton Junction branch of the railroad, which of course runs all the way to Washington, D.C. And it only took a couple of days for the federal quartermasters and railroad men to resupply the Army of the Potomac. And once his army was resupplied, Meade was ready to resume his advance. So he gets to Warrenton about July 25th. A few days later, his army is ready to continue the pursuit of Meade. Nobody at this point believes that that pursuit, that post-Gettysburg pursuit, has been halted. And Meade is still operating under orders that he had received on July 14th from Major General Henry W. Halleck, the Union General-in-Chief, to pursue Lee's army wherever it may have gone and cut it up. So Meade intends to continue the advance, and his plan is to move down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and get his way over the upper Rappahannock River and then see what Lee's going to do. Meade is not sure that Lee will stand and fight in Culpeper County because Culpeper County is not necessarily good defensive terrain. Culpeper is going to be the centerpiece of everything that's going to go on in August, September, and October in early November of 1863. So why is Culpeper so important? Why is it so problematic in a military sense? Well, it's important because it's essentially midway between Washington and Richmond. It is strategically located on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which runs up to the Potomac and then runs down to Gordonsville in Orange County, where it connects with the Virginia Central Railroad. The Virginia Central links the Shenandoah Valley to the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, which takes you down to Richmond and Petersburg. Culpeper has been a cockpit of the war through a lot of 1862, and the county, which is a very beautiful part of Virginia. It's extremely pleasing to the eye, rolling terrain, big wide open fields, the occasional forest, every once in a while a very abrupt mountain rising to maybe 1,000 feet, places like Stonehouse and Pony and Cedar Mountains and Thoroughfare Mountain kind of dominate this region. But Culpeper is militarily problematic for a number of reasons. First off, it's formed by the upper Rappahannock, which you see here, which is joined by the Rapidan, which flows more or less west-east. And when they join together, then you get the lower Rappahannock that flows on down to Fredericksburg and then ultimately out into Chesapeake Bay. So Culpeper roughly looks like a V laid on its side. That's why I refer to it as the Culpeper V, with the open mouth of the V pointing toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. And as you go west, the terrain gets more and more hilly, and then it begins to get mountainous. These are the foothills that are going to lead you into the Blue Ridge. The Robinson's River, which is really just a wide creek, forms a piece of the western boundary of Culpeper, separating it from Madison County over here. Culpeper is problematic militarily, in part because the ground on the north bank of the upper Rappahannock and the south bank of the Rapidan is higher than the ground inside Culpeper County itself. So you can sort of think of Culpeper as kind of setting in a bowl. And the reason this is problematic is because if you're the Confederates and you're occupying Culpeper County as you're doing now, then the Federals can use this high ground along the north bank of the river to basically maneuver out of your sight, to mass wherever they want, and potentially then lunge across one of the many fords that lead into the county. And so for the Confederates, this is a very dangerous situation. These fords are dominated by the ground on the north bank, and if the enemy gets into Culpeper County, then there is no good defensive terrain on which to anchor a battle line. There's no spot in Culpeper where you can anchor both your left and your right flank in such a place that they would be difficult for the enemy to outflank. So no good defensive ground in Culpeper County. In addition, if the Confederates were to fight a battle inside Culpeper County and then be forced to retreat, they would have very quickly to cross the Rapidan River. The county is not wide. If you travel the Orange and Alexandria Railroad from where it crosses on a bridge at Rappahannock Station, or at least it did cross on a bridge there until November 1862 when federal troops had burned to that bridge, and it's still laying in ruins at the beginning of August of 1863. But if you were to travel from Rappahannock Station, where the railroad crosses the upper Rappahannock down to Culpeper, and then follow the railroad down to Rapidan Station, where the O&A crosses the Rapidan on a still intact bridge, that's only 23 miles. And so if you fight a battle inside the Culpeper V and you lose, very quickly, you're going to find yourself up against a river. If you're the Confederates, it's going to be the Rappahannock. If you fight a defensive battle in here and you're the Federals, it's going to be the Upper Rappahannock. And all of these fords are going to be natural bottlenecks that will slow your retreat. And in addition, these rivers flood very quickly. One of the reasons it's called the Rapidan is because it rapidly rises after rain here to the west. And those fords could almost in the blink of an eye disappear. And that would leave your army trapped and vulnerable to enemy pursuit. So this is not a really good position. And of course, the county gets narrower as you go toward the junction of the Rapidan and the Upper Rappahannock River. So Meade suspected that the Gettysburg damaged Army of Northern Virginia would not necessarily be prone to make a stand inside Culpeper. And although General Meade, for reasons that we'll explore in just a few minutes, is not keen on using the Orange and Alexandria as a line of advance, he does believe that it's worth demonstrating along this line to see if Lee might abandon the Upper Rappahannock and perhaps even the Rapidan River without a fight. And so Meade, still operating under those orders to continue his pursuit of Lee, makes preparations to leap the Upper Rappahannock, rebuild the railroad bridge at Rappahannock Station, and then see what General Lee is going to do. Just as he is about to launch that operation, however, he suddenly gets a telegram from Union General Chief Major General Halleck, telling him to hold up, to stop his army on the Upper Rappahannock, to do nothing that might provoke a big battle. And the reason for this is, as Halleck explains, there are no reinforcements to send to Meade should he get into a large casualty-inducing fight. As Halleck puts it, every place has been stripped bare. Apparently, there's a thought of bringing troops from the west after the conquest of Vicksburg and Port Hudson and using them to reinforce the Army of the Potomac. Those troops are going to be sent back from whence they came, and many of them to the Trans-Mississippi region. But the other reason that Halleck tells me you can't get into a big battle right now is that I'm probably going to have to detach significant numbers of troops from the Army of the Potomac and send them north to enforce the draft. And there had been a big draft riot in New York City on July 13th. Lasted for a couple of days. There was draft resistance in other places throughout the North. And as a consequence of all of that, the draft had been suspended. And this was a problem because the North was beginning to run out of manpower. And this is something that most people don't realize. The North was having manpower problems just like the South was. Recruiting had basically dried up. Nobody wanted to enlist and be part of an army that seemed no closer to victory now than it had been at the beginning of the war. They'd certainly seen what the casualty lists looked like. They knew about the death tolls in the camps and the hospitals. And so the US Congress had gone to conscription. But conscription was not popular for a whole host of reasons. And General Meade didn't think much of it either because he believed it was not going to bring the right kind of men into the army. He was worried that it wouldn't bring the quantities needed either, but the men, the caliber of the men was as much a problem for Meade as the number of them, because he believed you had to have willing soldiers, men who would do and dare, who would be willing to die for the cause if you were going to win the war. And those were not kind of men that the draft was likely to produce. But without recruiting, the draft was the only way to get men into the army. Even if it did not account for a large number of the men actually put in uniform, it produced a system that helped to fund substitutes, that helped to get people to enlist for bounties or enlistment bonuses. It would encourage the veterans who are in the army to stay. Meade is aware that in the spring of 1864, the enlistments of all the 3-year men in the Army of the Potomac are going to expire. And if all of them go home, as most of the 2-year men had gone home in 1862, then the Army of the Potomac was going to be in woeful shape. The draft and the bounty system might be a way to induce these men to stay, to reenlist, to see the war through, but that was uncertain at this point. So the draft was critical to the Northern war effort. And Meade was told that he was going to have to send troops to help make the draft something that could be resumed, to get the draft going in. But there was also another problem that's kind of lurking underneath the surface. President Lincoln had been bitterly disappointed that Meade had not been able to destroy or wreck Lee's army before it retreated over the flooded Potomac River at Williamsport on July 13th of 1863. This had led to the famous dust-up between Lincoln and Halleck and Meade. When Halleck sends word to Meade of the president's dissatisfaction, Meade perceives that to be censure that he thinks is grossly undeserved. He demands to be replaced at the head of the army, and neither Lincoln or Halleck is willing to do that. So the word dissatisfaction is changed to disappointment. Lincoln and Halleck put the best face on this. They both make amends with Meade. Halleck says, well, you know, you might not really have been able to stop Meade's retreat. And sometimes bad things happen to good people through no fault of their own. Lincoln was willing to tell the 11th Corps commander, Major General O.O. Howard, that he was grateful for what Meade had done at Gettysburg without criticism for what was not done. But nonetheless, despite the fact that Lincoln and Halleck are going to forgive Meade for failing to destroy Lee at Williamsport, they're never going to forget that Meade failed to do that. And everything that Meade suggests or urges or proposes throughout the rest of 1863 is going to sort of be seen through the filter of that Williamsport disappointment. And this is also going to help set up a basic argument that these men are going to have over what the Army of the Potomac should be doing going forward. And so this brings us to what I call the O&A dilemma. So the Orange and Alexandria Railroad was the Army of the Potomac's line of supply, at least when it got to Warrenton following the withdrawal from the Loudoun Valley. The problem with using the Orange and Alexandria Railroad as a line of supply, however, was that it ran southwest. It moves away from Richmond and angles toward the Shenandoah Valley. In other words, it points toward no particular point. The Confederates absolutely must defend until you get very far south near Gordonsville, which is some 60 miles away from Warrenton. The other difficulty for the Orange and Alexandria, which is a single track line, and you see a picture of it here, is that the entire length of the railroad ran through Confederate territory. More importantly, it ran through what was called Mosby's Confederacy. So there were Confederate guerrillas all over northern Virginia. And it was possible for these guerrillas to attack the railroad, to burn bridges, to tear up track, to wreck culverts, and therefore disrupt the flow of supplies to the Army of the Potomac. And the only way that you could prevent that from happening was to station troops along the entire length of that railroad to keep Southern partisans, Southern raiders away from the O&A's track. Right now, with his army at Warrenton, Meade is having to spend 5,000 infantry to guard the O&A. And if he continues to advance down the O&A, he heads not only toward no point the Confederates must defend, but every mile he moves south, there are hundreds more men, and then ultimately thousands, and then many thousands of men he's going to have to leave behind him to protect the railroad. And at a time when Meade figures, and correctly, that the Army of the Potomac is not much bigger than the Army of Northern Virginia, then losing all of those men to railroad details is going to weaken the Army of the Potomac's combat power. And as he pushes down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, Lee can simply back up in front of him. Lee can keep retreating, forcing Meade to spool ever more men out to protect the railroad line. The Army of the Potomac's combat power getting weaker and weaker and weaker every mile it travels south. And Lee will retreat until he finds good ground that gives him all of the advantages, and then he'll turn and fight, probably from an entrenched position. And the Army of the Potomac, when it arrives at that point, will be too weak to successfully overcome rebel defenses. And in fact, it could be possible that at that juncture, the Army of Northern Virginia might actually outnumber the Army of the Potomac. And even if the Union Army were to win a victory, all that would do is force Lee back on Richmond to a shorter line of supply, to a stronger position. And when the Union Army goes after him, they'll have to spend more men to guard their lengthening supply line. And having been weakened by the battle losses of even a victory, they might not have enough troops to prevail. And so as Meade sees it, advancing down the Orange and Alexandria is a no-win situation for the North. He believes that you should abandon the O&A, move the Army of the Potomac's base of supply to Akia Landing on the lower Potomac, which is where it had been in 1862 after the Battle of Antietam. And from Akia Landing to Fredericksburg, you only have 15 miles of railroad track to protect. And this would therefore be a shorter line of supply. And what Meade wants to do is to make a rapid movement on Fredericksburg, cross the lower Rappahannock there before the Confederates could interfere, grab the high ground south of town. This would induce Lee to abandon the upper Rappahannock, abandon the Rapidan, fall back probably to the north of the South Anna in order to get between the Army of the Potomac and Richmond. That would give Meade a much more secure and shorter line of supply. He would have to spend less troops to guard it. He would be closer to Richmond. Lee could not retreat indefinitely because he would be backing up toward the most important point he must defend. And there would be all sorts of advantages that would accrue to the Army of the Potomac, not the least of which is more efficient use of its manpower. It would have more men to put on a firing line because it would spend less men defending a railroad line. Lincoln and Halleck reject this proposal. They want nothing to do with it, and for a couple of reasons. First off, the idea of taking the Army of the Potomac back to the scene of its worst disaster, just a little bit more than 6 months after that debacle, is a non-starter. It would suggest strategic bankruptcy for the North. And there are going to be congressional elections in October and November, and it's not pleasant to think about what the Democrats would do with the news that the Army of the Potomac has returned to that horrific field where it had been mauled in December of 1862. So Lincoln and Halleck see no need for a change of base, and as they argue to Meade, going to Akia Landing in Fredericksburg seems to make Richmond the Army of the Potomac's objective. And Lincoln has been saying since the Peninsula Campaign that Richmond is not the objective of the Army of the Potomac. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia is the federal objective. Meade's job is to go out and find Lee to fight him and destroy his army. If it can't be done in one great big battle, then in a series of battles. And where that fight happens doesn't really matter. And as Lincoln and Halleck reason it, it will be no harder to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia somewhere along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad than it would be to destroy it somewhere between Fredericksburg and Richmond. Wherever you go, you're going to run into the same difficulties. The Confederates can dig the same kind of trenches. The numbers are not going to be that significant. And so they perceive that this highly rational, well thought out, strategically viable idea of changing the Army of the Potomac's base to Akia Landing is an indication that Meade, like McClellan before him, is not truly an aggressive general. He doesn't have that killer instinct. It sort of reinforces the suspicion that was formed, rightly or wrongly, in the administration when Meade failed to destroy Lee at Williamsport, when he failed to trap him in the Shenandoah Valley. So against Meade's better wishes, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad is going to remain his line of advance, although that advance is not supposed to take place now because he's going to pull up on the upper Rappahannock. But in addition to being told not to go get in a great big battle, Halleck also relays to me that he wants him to keep up a threatening stance. He wants him to keep the Army of Northern Virginia sort of occupied. And as Meade sees it, well, the easiest way to keep the Army of Northern Virginia occupied is to go ahead with my plan to leap the upper Rappahannock and at least grab its south bank so I can rebuild the bridge at Rappahannock Station. And having that railroad bridge rebuilt is a critical prerequisite to any future Union advance along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. So building bridgeheads on the south bank of the upper Rappahannock seems like a pretty good way to keep up an aggressive stance toward the rebel army. And so on August 1st of 1863, Meade is going to make his move. In fact, it's going to begin the night before when infantry from the 12th Corps are sent to Kelly's Ford and told to establish a bridgehead there. Now, Kelly's Ford is one of those places where there is very dominant high ground on the north bank of the upper Rappahannock, or in this case, it would literally be the east bank. And once the Federals get that high ground, there's no way the Confederates can hold Kelly's Ford, and they only had a cavalry detachment here anyway. And the idea was that once this bridgehead is established and pontoon bridges are put down, John Buford's 1st Cavalry Division is supposed to cross on those pontoon boats and then sweep up the upper Rappahannock River toward Rappahannock Station, clearing it as he goes and opening the way for the Federal First Corps to send a division over the river and create a bridgehead that will allow workers to rebuild the railroad bridge at Rappahannock Station. At least that's the plan. Buford, however, misunderstands the plan. This is very uncharacteristic of him, but he's very tired from the wearying Gettysburg campaign and everything that's happened. He's recently had several members of his family die in a cholera epidemic, so he's somewhat distracted. And he gets the idea that he's actually supposed to cross the river up here at Beverly Ford, which is completely wrong. And it causes some confusion on the morning of August 1st, but eventually the Federals work that out. And Buford crosses the upper Rappahannock, and then he begins to push down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad toward Culpeper Courthouse. And the only thing in front of him is Hampton's brigade of cavalry, which is now under the command of Colonel Lawrence Baker, because Hampton had been wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg and is recuperating. Baker's only got about 900 men, and his brigade's in very bad shape. It's tattered, it's worn out. His horses haven't been receiving any regular ration of grain. And in fact, when he deploys to meet Buford, some of the Confederate horses are so weak, they actually collapse under the weight of their riders. And Baker has to order to the rear any men or horses who are just not in physical condition to actually fight. This is an extremely hot day. Northern Virginia is in the midst of a horrible, horrible heat wave. Soldiers said that the blowing wind was like facing a furnace, that the pewter buttons would melt on their uniforms. And so this was a miserable time of year to fight. But Buford has the advantage. He's not only got his own 2 brigades under Devon and Chapman, but he's also got the reserve cavalry brigade out of Washington under Wesley Merritt. So he's got a couple thousand men to face less than 1,000 Confederates. And he very adroitly uses these superior numbers. Every place the Confederates try and make a stand, he outflanks them. He eventually pushes them back to within about 2 miles of Culpeper Courthouse. And it's at this point that Confederate reinforcements reach the field. First, Jones Cavalry Brigade and some horse artillery that Stuart has ordered down from Rixieville arrived to hit the Union flank. Shortly after that, the first 2 brigades of Richard Anderson's infantry division reached the field under Posey and Mahone to reinforce Baker. And then the battle goes into reverse. And it's the Federals who are forced to retreat steadily back toward the Rappahannock, the Confederates outflanking them every place they make a stand. And by the end of the day, Buford is basically only 2 miles away from the upper Rappahannock River. So he's managed to do the most important thing, which is to clear the way for Federal infantry to cross at Rappahannock Station, establish a bridgehead that will allow the railroad bridge to be rebuilt. And he has found out that the Confederates are still in Culpeper County and that they're not inclined to abandon it. So this is useful information, but it's come at a high cost. The Federals took just about 200 casualties, and the Confederates took a very similar number of losses. And so this has been a pretty bloody fight for the cavalry. And interestingly enough, this is, according to the official records, the last battle of the Gettysburg campaign, because now any attempt by the Army of the Potomac to continue its pursuit is over. And the Army of the Potomac is not going to move south for 6 more weeks. Lee, on the other hand, has decided that there is no field for battle that is advantageous to his army in Culpeper. And so after this August 1st fighting, he pulls his troops below the Rapidan, but he tells Stuart to keep his cavalry inside Culpeper County. For one reason, Lee's not inclined to give the Yankees any more Virginia than he absolutely must, but also this will allow the cavalry to provide a nice buffer between the Federals and the A&V, which desperately needs time to recover and recuperate from the Gettysburg campaign. Both armies do, in fact. But Lee warns Stuart, stay in Culpeper County only if you can do it without sacrificing your men. So he doesn't intend Stuart to make a fight for Culpeper, to make any kind of major stand. But if the Yankees aren't going to push us, you stay there, provide this buffer. And that's what Stuart is going to do. So for the next 6 weeks, the A and B and the AOP are going to rest, and they're going to recover. And they're going to recover very quickly. They both go through something of a desertion crisis that has to be met with court martials and firing squads in order to put it down. But that is done, and it is done effectively. And by the beginning of September of 1863, both are going to have the same strength that they did on the first day of Gettysburg. This is mostly through men who'd been wounded and sick in previous campaigns coming back, some conscripts, some recruits, but it's mostly the return of veteran troops who have been in the hospital. But by the beginning of September of 1863, Lee's just under 73,000 men in strength, and Meade is at 88,000. So Gettysburg inflicted no long-lasting immediate wound on either army. And as the armies recover, Lee is very anxious to resume the offensive. He wants the initiative. And he tells Davis that he would like to attack Meade. If Meade's not going to move, I want to go after him. The difficulty, of course, for the Confederates is supply. And so for logistic reasons, throughout August, it's just not possible for the rebels to launch an offensive. And while the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia are sitting there and they're recuperating along the Rapidan and the upper Rappahannock, events, of course, are taking place elsewhere. And what's happening is the Union Army under Ambrose Burnside is advancing out of Kentucky toward Knoxville. William Rosecrans' Union Army of the Cumberland is moving against Bragg at Chattanooga. And the Confederate forces here are very hard pressed. And this becomes a crisis for the Richmond authorities. It's a crisis that's sort of slow in dawning on them. The information seems to come in very, very slowly. But on August 24th, Jeff Davis calls Robert E. Lee to Richmond, and he asks him to confer on the South strategic situation. Lee stays there for a week. And although they're looking at all of the problems that the Confederacy is facing militarily, the primary focus is what to do about Chattanooga. And Davis and Lee can only come up with two possibilities for helping Bragg hold on to Chattanooga and hopefully go over to the offensive and drive Rosecrans back on Nashville. The great fear is that Burnside will turn and move toward Chattanooga and link up with Rosecrans to make a Union Army 90,000 men strong that the Confederates here would not be able to resist. How do you save Chattanooga? There are two options. Option one, take a lot of troops in the Army of Northern Virginia and send them through Knoxville to Chattanooga to reinforce Bragg. Option number two, and this is the one that Lee favors, is to attack Meade in Virginia, beat him badly, drive him back on Washington, and create a crisis that will force Lincoln to pull Western troops away from Burnside and Rosecrans to reinforce Meade trying to defend the Union capital. And this sort of sounds familiar. It's because this is the same dilemma that the Confederacy had faced in May of 1863, only then the threatened point was Vicksburg, and the same solutions had been put forward. Lee could go on the offensive and try and crush the Army of the Potomac and force the Federals to pull troops from the west to the east, or Lee could send a lot of troops to reinforce the Confederate armies defending Vicksburg. And the decision had been made to let Lee go on to the offensive. And that decision had led to the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, here we are a handful of months later, same dilemma, although a different threat point, same two proposals for dealing with it. Lee, again, wants to go onto the offensive. And just as he had in May of 1863, Jefferson Davis concurs and tells Lee to go ahead. Just as Lee starts preparations, however, the news comes in that Knoxville and Chattanooga are now under severe threat. And in fact, the word that comes in is received from Confederate forces defending southwestern Virginia, who've lost all communication with rebel troops around Knoxville. Most of the defenders of Knoxville under General Simon Boulevard Buckner have been pulled down by Bragg to reinforce his army defending Chattanooga. And so this makes East Tennessee extremely weak. And the Confederate commander down here is talking about burning a key railroad bridge to prevent any federal advance into southwestern Virginia from East Tennessee. And that galvanizes everything for Jeff Davis. He sends word, don't burn the bridge. We've got to do something to save Knoxville and Chattanooga immediately. And so he tells Lee, forget about your offensive. I want you to move General Longstreet's corps to Richmond so that we can dispatch it to reinforce General Bragg. And this is not what Lee thinks should be done. He's afraid that Longstreet is being sent someplace where, as he put it, he will do no good when he is much needed in Virginia. But President Davis believes that he has no real alternative here. The situation in Chattanooga is too dangerous. There must be reinforcements in Bragg. They must be substantial reinforcements. And the only place those reinforcements can be had is the Army of Northern Virginia. So Longstreet is shipped to Richmond between September 7th and 14th. He comes down to Richmond. He's going to send 2 brigades of Georgians to reinforce Charleston. Charleston is, of course, under siege and can use reinforcements, but the real motivation here is fear that if these troops go close to Georgia, there will be a lot of desertion, so better to send them someplace where that's not so tempting. Ultimately, 2 of Longstreet's divisions are going to be shipped west, and Longstreet is a good choice for this mission. He believes that this is what the Confederacy should be doing. He had advocated the same kind of move when the endangered point was Vicksburg. But even before Longstreet's troops are assembled in Richmond and ready to depart, the Confederates learned that Knoxville has fallen to the Federals. In fact, it fell on September 2nd, and Bragg abandons Chattanooga on September 9th. If Lee had known that these 2 points had already fallen, he later said he would have urged Longstreet be sent to recapture Knoxville directly. But Davis decides that Bragg and the army at Chattanooga needs reinforcement more than Knoxville needs to be recaptured. If you can save Chattanooga, then you can go rescue Knoxville, as Davis sees it. And so Longstreet's 2 divisions are sent on a 700-mile odyssey through the Deep South up toward northern Georgia, which is where Bragg has retreated to after abandoning Chattanooga and where he's maneuvering to try and bring Rosecrans and the Union Army of the Cumberland to battle. So rumors of Longstreet's departure get north very, very quickly, and this makes Halleck and Lincoln and the Federal High Command extremely uneasy. And the question they have to answer is, has Longstreet really gone? Are these rumors true? And so Meade is given orders to, quote, find something out, advance on Lee and find out if Longstreet is really gone. And so this leads to orders from Meade to Major General Alfred Pleasonton, commander of the Army of the Potomac's cavalry, to advance into Culpeper County and see what it can learn. This is one of the few occasions in the war where the Federal Cavalry Corps is going to act as a concerted body on the same field. And so Pleasonton plans a 3-pronged advance on Culpeper. David Gregg's 2nd Cavalry Division coming down from Sulphur Springs, Jefferson, Rixeyville to hit Culpeper from the west. Buford advancing down the railroad again. Kilpatrick's 3rd Cavalry Division leaving from Kelly's Ford, swinging down toward Stevensburg to make sure the Confederates weren't up to mischief here, and then coming up to Brandy Station to link up with Buford, and all 3 concentrating on Culpeper Courthouse to find out, is the rebel army still here, and is Longstreet still part of that rebel army? And so on dawn of September 13th, 1863, these are the dispositions. There's Gregg, there's Buford, there's Kilpatrick. Jeb Stuart has only 4 cavalry brigades in Culpeper County, along with his horse artillery. He's going to be grossly outnumbered. And remember, he's not supposed to make a stand here, but he's accumulated a lot of supplies at Culpeper Courthouse, and he doesn't want to abandon these. Abandoning supplies, not something the Confederate Army can readily do, but he can't get all of those supplies away until the daily train comes up to Culpeper, and it's going to be almost noon before it arrives. And so Stuart's going to have to fight to protect his supplies and get time in order for those supplies to be scurried below the Rapidan to safety. So this leads to the Battle of Culpeper Courthouse, extremely fascinating engagement. The Federals push down the O&A just as they had in August. The Confederates make a stubborn resistance wherever the terrain permits them. But this is ultimately when Kilpatrick joins Buford. This is 2 cavalry divisions basically fighting 2 rebel brigades, and the Confederates are pushed back on Culpeper Courthouse, and they have to take position on the ridge overlooking Mountain Run, atop which Culpeper sits. The Federals come in, they line up on the other ridge. Gregg is pushing down. Most of the Confederate cavalry redeploys to the south. The Federals deploy to the north. You can see the mass of Federal cavalry going into position here. There's Culpeper Courthouse. This horizon line is the valley that leads down into Mountain Run. Confederate horse artillery is here, and a big cavalry horse artillery duel takes place between these 2 ridges. Ultimately, the Federals get tired of that, and Pleasanton tells Kilpatrick to drive the rebels away. Kilpatrick sends Davies' brigade to do this. It leads to a very dramatic charge by the 2nd New York Cavalry. Custer's brigade tries to get across Mountain Run, but this is a very difficult stream, miry, steep bank. And so the Federals really don't get across. Custer, with a little vanguard from his headquarters, manages to get over, and he charges the right flank gun of the Confederate horse artillery just about the time that the 2nd New York Cavalry comes up against it, advancing on it from such a steep slope leading down to Mountain Run that the Confederates actually can't see these Federals until they're almost right on top of them. And the Confederates, seeing Custer instead, fire at him, actually kill his horse and slightly wound him. But the Federal cavalry manages to overrun that Confederate field piece in hand-to-hand combat. And then another gun is captured before it can be scurried away. The Federals sweep into Culpeper itself, capture a 3rd rebel gun as it's fleeing through the town. Then they drive the Confederates away from the hills south of town and advance on Pony Mountain, where the Confederates are making a stand. And they manage to stymie the Federals until nightfall. But after dark, the rebel cavalry is going to retreat to the Rapidan and the safety of entrenchments and Confederate infantry. The Federals are going to pursue, and the next morning on September 14th, they're going to probe at all of the Rapidan fords. This is going to lead to some intense fighting. This is actually a drawing by Alfred Woad this is Raccoon Ford, the Federal artillery firing on the rebels. You can see the high ground on the south bank there. There's the position of the Confederate guns. Confederate fire was so intense here, and they had such an advantage of being on high ground, that the Federal gunners actually laid down for cover when they didn't have to be upright to load their guns. And it only took a couple of hours of fighting for Pleasanton to figure out Lee's army is behind the Rapidan. Longstreet, in fact, is gone, but Ewell and Hill are still there, and Lee is determined to fight. So now Meade has found out what the administration wants to know, and he sends word back. The Confederates are behind the Rapidan. The river is fortified. Frontal attack would be pointless. Longstreet is gone. What do you want me to do? Remember, he's still under orders to provoke no big battle, to do nothing rash. So it seems reasonable to him to ask, what does the administration want him to do? But the administration, increasingly distracted by what's going on in northern Georgia, is slow to respond. So Meade is left to kind of figure out this mess on his own, and he masses his infantry on the upper Rappahannock so it could move into Culpeper County if he is so ordered to do. But on September 16th, he still doesn't have orders, and this mightily frustrates him. And he writes to his wife, Margaret, who's a close confidant. And he says, you know, this is unfair. I deserve clear instructions, no ambiguity here. It seems to me that the administration would be happy if I were to go out and fight and win, but they really don't want their fingerprints on any defeat. They're setting me up to be the scapegoat so that in case of disaster, I can be blamed. And by the way, this is what they've done to all my predecessors, and I'm not going to let them do it to me. It's not fair that at one point they tell me, oh, you can't follow your own plans. And at another point, they leave me to figure out what to do all on my own. But this is where Meade is, and he's a dutiful soldier. He's a good soldier. He's got a good strategic mind, and he decides that in the absence of orders from Washington, he's going to go ahead and move his infantry into Culpeper County. And what he's hoping here is if his infantry moves into Culpeper County, Lee will abandon the Rapidan. Lee, of course, has been weakened. Longstreet's departure has cut the size of his army by a third. So he's only got 55,000 men. Meade sent 9,200 men north to enforce the draft, but that hasn't affected his strength at all. More convalescents have been coming in, additional units have been added to the Army of the Potomac. He's still 88,000 men. And so it would make sense for Lee to retreat closer to Richmond at this point. But when the Army of the Potomac reaches Culpeper Courthouse, lo and behold, Lee doesn't budge. He's not going to retreat. The Federals are going to have to make him retreat. And now Meade's got a problem. He's taken his army into the dangerous Culpeper V, which is just as poor a defensive ground for the Federals as it is for the Confederates. Now the rebels have the high ground below a river. They could mass beneath it and then come out from behind it to swing into Madison County and either move north to try and cut the Army of the Potomac off from Washington, basically a replay of the Second Manassas Campaign, or make a more shallow turning movement to attack the Army of the Potomac from the northwest and force it to fight in the shallow V of these two rivers. And the only way to avoid either one of those dangers would be for the Army of the Potomac to retreat north of the Rappahannock and maybe even further toward Washington, maybe as far as Centerville, to find a good ground where it can make a stand between the capital and the rebels. But Meade, having advanced, now can't retreat. Politically, that is simply not viable. And Lincoln and Halleck and others in the administration are frustrated that Meade is not suddenly saying, hey, I have this plan for an offensive. He's not showing any signs of wanting to be aggressive. They don't understand. They've kind of left him out on a limb and to figure it out on his own. And they're not giving the kind of backing or guidance that he has a right to disturb, he has a right to expect. And so this is a very dysfunctional relationship between Lincoln, Halleck, Stanton, and General Meade. But now that Meade is where he is, he knows that he's expected to do something aggressive, but what can he do? A frontal attack against the fortified fords would be suicide. So what Meade does is he pulls his cavalry back away from the river. He sends infantry down to take its place, and then he begins to look for a way to turn Lee's flanks. Now, if he goes east to turn Lee's right flank, he's going to go toward Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, and the Federal Army already knows about the roads and the fords and the terrain there. But it doesn't know much about the ground to the west that they would have to traverse to get around Lee's left flank. Madison County has not seen any serious campaigning, and the Army of the Potomac really knows very little about it. So Meade orders a reconnaissance to look into the roads, to look into the fords, that sort of thing. And Pleasanton sends two divisions, Kilpatrick's and Buford's, with Buford in overall command to conduct a reconnaissance of Madison County. They cross Robinson's River on the 21st, and then on the 22nd, they move from Madison Courthouse and spread out, Kilpatrick going off to the west, Buford sending one brigade under Chapman down toward Jack's shop, Devon's brigade splitting off from Buford's column to go and check out Barnes Ford, and one regiment from Devon, the 6th New York Cavalry, going up here to Locust Hill to look at Fry's Ford and hold it as a potential escape hatch for the Federal cavalry if something unexpected goes wrong. So, and very interesting, isn't it, that Pleasanton sends Buford to be in charge of all of this. If this was Jeb Stuart, we know what Stuart would have done. He would have gone with two of his three divisions, but this is not the kind of operator that Pleasanton is. A Federal deserter tells the Confederates what the Yankee cavalry is about to do, and Stuart with Hampton's division, the Confederate cavalry on September 9th had been reorganized into a corps, divided into two divisions, one under Wade Hampton, one under Fitzhugh Lee. Hampton is still recuperating from his Gettysburg wounds, so Stuart is personally running Hampton's division. Stuart gets word of what the Federals are doing, and they perceive this not as reconnaissance, but as an intended raid on Gordonsville, that critical railroad link where the O&A meets the Virginia Central. And so Stuart believes that the best way to disrupt the federal plans is to go over to the offensive, and he moves his division into Madison County towards Jack's Shop to meet the Federals. And on the 22nd of September, this leads to the Battle of Jack's Shop, which is one of those famous battles, but it's also one that's never really been studied. It's not well understood. And one of the things my research revealed is that battle did not go at all the way as it is typically represented as going. So initially, Chapman's brigade with Buford in person and a battery of federal artillery run into Stuart with Hampton's whole division and the Confederate horse artillery, and there's a standoff. Both sides deploy their gun, they deploy their sharpshooters. Buford doesn't really seem to be too interested in pushing the advance, and that's because as soon as he ran into Stuart, he sent word to Kilpatrick to give up his reconnaissance and cross the river and attack Stuart in the rear. Now, Stuart has sent men up on Thoroughfare Mountain, and they had seen Kilpatrick ride off to the west. And so Stuart knows that Kilpatrick is out here somewhere, and he leaves one brigade with reinforcements to watch his rear. Stuart is not going to be caught by surprise. He anticipates what Buford might be doing. But by the time that the courier reaches Kilpatrick, he sent Custer off to the west to scout other fords. He sent various other regiments on various other missions. And so he's only got Davies' brigade with him, and Davies' brigade is reduced basically to just 2 regiments. He's got just 2 regiments and a battery of artillery, the 5th New York, the 2nd New York, and Battery C of the 3rd U.S. Cavalry. And with that, he tries to carry out Buford's orders. He crosses the Rapidan and he moves toward Jack's Shop, where he can hear the fighting, but he's having to move through a woods road that is so narrow he can only assume a column of 2s. And so when he comes up on Jack's Shop, the Federals are not in a condition where they can rapidly deploy. And more than that, they are shocked to find out that they're not about to hit the rear of an unsuspecting Confederate column, that in fact, a brigade and a half is waiting for them in line of battle and is ready to attack them. This is the moment when half of Stuart's artillery turns around and fires toward the rear while the other half is still firing toward the north. In a typical telling of it, there is another federal force that's coming in from the east, and the Confederate artillery is firing in 3 directions. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen at all. And so Kilpatrick, instead of being the aggressor, is suddenly the defender, and the Confederates attack him with such force that he orders the 5th New York and his artillery to get on the road and retreat back across the Rapidan. The 2nd New York holding out just long enough for their comrades to get on the road. And now Stuart disentangles from Buford and Chapman, who are happy to let him go. And he chases Kilpatrick all the way down to Liberty Mills. Kilpatrick is almost caught and destroyed. Stuart had sent word for Confederate infantry from Cadmus Wilcox's division to occupy Liberty Mills, but Kilpatrick and Davies get across the river just in the nick of time before Wilcox's infantry shows up. As twilight fades away, Confederates continue the pursuit to Marsh Creek, where the Federals turn and make a stand, and there the fighting halts for the night. Fitz-Lee's division had been summoned from the eastern flank of the Confederate line to reinforce Stuart. And now that the Confederates have united, Buford says, well, we've conducted our reconnaissance. We found out what we need to go. We're not here to fight. And so the Federals overnight reassemble near Providence Church and then begin to withdraw back to Culpeper County. Stuart follows and snaps at their rear guard, captures some prisoners, but the Federals managed to get back into Culpeper County without any real damage. So it had been kind of a tough fight at Jack's Shop, significant casualties on both sides, but in the aftermath of it, both Buford and Stuart claimed victory. Buford says, hey, we fought Stuart's entire corps and we conducted the reconnaissance. We carried out our mission. And Stuart says, we stopped the Federal raid on Gordonsville. They retreated instead. And although that's not actually what the Federals have been trying to do, for the Confederate perspective, this is what they believed. And so Stuart claims victory. Buford claims victory, and in a way, you could argue both of them had a legitimate right to do so. Lee understands what Meade is doing. He says, okay, he's probed my left, and he'll probably probe my right. We've got to be ready to deal with the Federal Army when it tries to cross the Rapidan, either to the east or the west. But before anything like that can happen, the Battle of Chickamauga intervenes. In fact, the battle had been fought and climaxed just before the Federals rode into Madison County. Troops from Longstreet's Corps arrived just in time to help Bragg break the Union line, drive the Army of the Cumberland in retreat back onto Chattanooga, where eventually Bragg, after a sort of slow start, is going to show up and lay the Army of the Cumberland under siege. And this creates a crisis now for the Federals. There has been a major defeat in northern Georgia. Both Chattanooga and the Army of Cumberland are in danger of being lost. Halleck had seen the Confederates concentrating against Rosecrans and had sent orders for Grant to begin shifting troops over to help Rosecrans out. But there is no telegraph link to Vicksburg beyond Memphis. And so any message sent from Washington can go by telegraph to Memphis, then it has to be sent by boat down to Vicksburg. And so the response of the Federals under Grant is necessarily slow. And they're going to have to cross the whole width of Tennessee in order to get to Rosecrans and rebuild a railroad along the way if they want to eat. And that's going to take many weeks. And Secretary of War Edwin Stanton says that's going to take far too long. The situation is too dire. We need to reinforce Rosecrans much more quickly than that. And I propose taking 30,000 troops from the Army of the Potomac, putting them on train, and sending them to the vicinity of Chattanooga. And he claims that Union railroads could get this done in just 5 days. And this leads the administration to call Meade to Washington for consultation. And Lincoln tells him, it looks like you're standing on the defensive. If you're standing on the defensive, you don't need as many men as you have. And Secretary Stanton wants to take 20 or 30,000 of your troops and send them to help Rosecrans. Meade sees in this suggestion criticism of his activity, which he thinks is grossly unfair. Remember, he's really had his feet shackled by the administration. He hasn't been given strategic flexibility. He hasn't been given any real advice. They haven't even approved the plans that he's carried out. And so he says, look, if you think I've been too slow or prudent, then let me repeat what I've said many times before. You should replace me with somebody that you're happy with. Replacing the victor of Gettysburg, of course, is non-starter. And Halleck says, no, that's not going to happen. And so Meade argues against having his army reduced in size. And he leaves Washington that afternoon convinced that he'd won the argument. But in fact, he had that night, September 24th, there is a midnight meeting in the War Department, and Lincoln is there, and Stanton is there, and Halleck is there. Joe Hooker, Meade's predecessor in command of the Army of the Potomac, is there. The chief of Union Railroad Operations, Colonel McCallum, is there, and Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, are there. And Stanton advances his argument again. He says Meade is much stronger than Lee, but he's not going to attack him. His great strength where it is useless. I think we should take 20,000 men, put them on trains, and send them to Chattanooga. Lincoln and Halleck aren't so sure. Lee is weak, weaker than he's ever been. This seems to suggest an opportunity to achieve something really decisive in Virginia for the first time almost since the start of the war. But Stanton's argument is hard to ignore. And so Lincoln, who quips that, hey, I bet if you gave the order tonight, they couldn't get the 20,000 troops from the Rapidan to Washington in 5 days, nonetheless tells Halleck to contact me to find out if he's about to undertake an offensive. If he is, then his army's going to be left alone. If not, well. And so Halleck telegraphs Meade at 2 a.m. on September 25th and says, are you on the verge of undertaking an offensive? And Meade sends back a message that says, well, I'm just getting the information from Buford. I plan to do something, but I have no specific plans, no timetable. And when Halleck shows that to Lincoln, the decision is made. Not good enough. And so the 11th and 12th Corps under Major General Otis Howard and Major General Henry Slocum are detached from the Army of the Potomac, shipped to Washington expeditiously by Meade, by the way. He handles this very quickly. Within 2 days, those corps are in the capital and on their way west. But nonetheless, this is going to deduct 13,600 men from the Army of the Potomac. Interestingly, it doesn't change that Army strength at all, because just as these 13,000 men head west, the 9,200 men who had been sent north to enforce the draft returned to the Army. And so Meade's strength is basically unchanged. He's still somewhere around 88,000 men. Lee is reduced to 55,000. Meade still has a numerical advantage, but as far as he is concerned, the order to send the 11th and the 12th Corps west was the same thing as an order to put the Army of the Potomac on the defensive. He believes he does not have now the preponderance of infantry necessary to attack and overcome Confederate fortifications. The Army of the Potomac might be much bigger, Meade says, but it's bigger in terms of artillery and bigger in terms of cavalry. And what really matters is infantry. And infantry to infantry, the numbers are too close. We do not have the requisite advantage. And so he believes that he has no choice but to go over to the defensive, even though his army is still sitting awkwardly inside the very dangerous Culpeper V. Lee is going to see things very differently. He knows he's still outnumbered, but the disappearance of 2 federal corps means the Army of the Potomac is weaker probably than it has been in some time. He has been wanting to go over to the offensive since August. He had begun to prepare an offensive in September to have the rug pulled out from under him by events around Chattanooga. Now, however, he has an opportunity, and he's going to begin to concentrate his army around Orange Courthouse in the first week of October in preparation for launching that flanking attack around through Madison County that Meade has anticipated and dreaded. And so we are on the verge of the last great offensive of the Army of Northern Virginia, what will become known as the Bristoe Station Campaign. And that campaign will be the subject of my next presentation.